So we'll offer now some practical alarm clocks, fourth way style alarm clocks, exercises to help us struggle with identification and promote more light into our cosmology and psychology. So, all right. So I guess it's important to create exercises for each center, each function. Yeah, intellectual center, emotional center, instinctive center, moving center, sex center, because each one of these centers they are stimulus response mechanism, and something happens internally or externally, and they generate impulses. They are shooting bubbles, these bubbles of me, bubbles of eyes, and then in a usual state of waking sleep, we identify each one of them. So I guess let's take it one by one. In the intellectual center, yeah, the tendency to what happens in a lower state of consciousness, the intellectual center basically is full of thoughts, images, memories, voices, past, future, worries, desires, and consciousness is dormant, kind of hypnotized by it. Yeah. So any work with catching identification, basically catching yourself in this daydreaming that is unnecessary. Yeah, the unnecessary mind activity, unnecessary uncontrolled mind activity. Whenever you catch yourself and then realize that I've been taken as a taxi into no man's land, and just realize that and return, coming back to sensing, feeling the body, sensing the sense of one's own presence. This is very good exercise ongoingly, you know. But this is a little bit too big. It's too, you know, because it's pervasive, happens all the time. Yeah. So I guess some of my favorite ones would be, as we mentioned before, to put aside some time, like 10 minutes, when I'm engaged in some kinetic activity, in something where I don't need to think, like walking or driving the bicycle or running or anything like that. Yeah, the body is doing it and the mind tends to be checked out. The exercise is 10 minutes on the clock to just really not allow oneself to continue these stories. So a thought comes, we notice, we don't stick to it. We don't embroider. The exercise is no embroidery, basically. That's the exercise. Another thought comes, we notice, we don't get involved with it. Stay aware of the light, the colors, the body. Yeah, another way to look at it is that which is listening, the listener to the thoughts, which is consciousness, is closed for business. Imagine like one of those cashier, it has a break. Yeah, it's like closed, and people come and they knock, they say, hey, yeah, it's like, no, the cashier is having a break, not engaging with thinking. Yeah, so this is good to do a few minutes. Yeah, in this way, what happens? You get more. You have more chances to discover experientially what Peter talked just before here. This to discover the space or that in which the thoughts arise and that in which the thoughts die. That whatever that is not a thought. In some tradition, they call it the yoga of the interval. To be aware enough to notice that nothing, the aware nothing, the aware silence, when a thought just died out and before one comes, that is the being. Yeah. So that's a good exercise, you know, with the intellectual center. For the emotional center, I mean, let's say for
before
the.
you go to the
Go ahead.
emotional center, I'd like to add I can add a couple of things.
Yeah.
Another useful thing to try to do when speaking, because when we speak, whether it's coming from our instinctive center or our emotional center, it has to come through our intellectual center when we speak. And the thing that a useful thing to do is to slow down. A lot of times what happens, and you see this a lot now, is when we're identified, one center will try to do the work for another center. And what happens when we talk too fast, the moving center is now trying to do the work of the intellectual center. Or another way to say it is intruding upon the intellectual center. It's imposing its own energy on the intellectual center. The intellectual center is trying to operate with the energy of the moving center, which is a faster energy than the intellectual center. So to slow down when speaking. Another thing is when you forget what you wanted to say.
When you lost the eye.
When you lost the eye, you lost the thought, don't panic. Don't go chasing after it. Try to just exist in the gap there, in that emptiness. This would be a way to not identify. Don't be identified with having lost identity with the thought. Because that's what happens is we think it was me. I'm gone. I must now go back and catch me. No, it was just a thought. And to rest, so to say, comfortably, securely, knowingly in the silence of presence when that happens. And another thing related to that is if you find yourself confused in a moment, you can't, the intellectual center is always trying to solve some kind of problem, find the definition, find the answer, the solution. And you don't need to. And if you find yourself feeling confused, oh my gosh, I can't figure it out. So just again, do the same thing as with when you forget a thought. You can't remember a thought. Let yourself go into the space, the emptiness behind the confusion. Yeah. And it will clear itself up. The intellectual center tries to clear itself up itself, and that often doesn't work. It makes the confusion worse. Just sit back, so to speak, behind your intellectual center, behind the thoughts, and let it normalize, neutralize. And it will do that if we're not identified with it.
Yeah, to further continue with the same exercise that Peter talked about when we lost the thought, lost the eye, instead of freaking out, yeah, to just relax in that space. And, very likely we may have some emotional stuff now. We may have some shame or so-called embarrassment, which is AKA inner considering. Yeah, we'll talk next time. So observe that and be comfortable with that little energy of so-called the shame. You're aware of it. Yeah. And, especially now we are, so you're presenting or you're some authority, there's all this, and now I lost the thought. Another one, the intellectual center, when there's not enough awareness in the system, it really likes to just label things and associate. So just this, coming back to the example of walking in the woods or walking through a street of Italy or somewhere, notice how we are looking around and some aspect of the intellectual center will just label things. Oh, this is that, and this is like that, and just labeling reality. And the intellectual center has been trained like that due to wrong education, where we, remember when we were little kids, or you see mothers that are proud of their kids and they want them to be intelligent little boys, and they say, oh yeah, this is yellow, and this is a brick, and this is a car. So, the mother teaches them words, which is, we need to learn words, but somehow we are praised for that. Like we know the label, yeah? So I no longer see the oak tree. I no longer see the cloud. I no longer see anything. I just have these labels which are empty, So try to walk around in nature or to walk around, to look at things without going into labeling, without going to the memory bank. See, just to see consciously without resorting to the memory bank labeling. And whenever the label comes, notice, but don't go involved with it. Yeah. In this way, we start to relax the unnecessary use of the intellectual center. Also, like you can go to the Louvre, you can go to the Versailles or some great museum. I've seen this. You can go through all these paintings, Mona Lisa, Botticelli, all these people. And instead of looking at it with presence and openness, I'm like, oh yeah, that's Botticelli and he was part of this school. And then, oh yeah, that's that one. So now basically the intellectual center is regurgitating all of these books, missing the actual frequency of beauty, So watch out for that.
I think a similar thing that I mentioned about the intellectual center applies to the moving center. When we're more identified, we move faster. There's more frenzied movement. We're in a hurry. We try to do two things at once with the moving center. And so one way to not be less identified in relation to the moving center is to slow down. Just do one thing at a time. Do what we're doing. If we feel hurried, to realize, you can't get there before you get there. And also, this is interesting. If you're late for your plane and you have to run for the plane, it doesn't mean you have to be identified with the moving center. That's the right work of the moving center in that moment, is to run for the plane. Because if you get there in 30 seconds instead of 2 minutes, you might make it. That's good. But you can actually be in a hurry without being identified. There's a famous quote I like from a famous basketball coach. And the saying was, and he would teach his players, be quick, but not in a hurry. Because when you're in a hurry, you make a mistake. But if you're quick and you're not in a hurry, you'll be very effective in playing the game of basketball in this instance. So that same thing, we can be quick and not in a hurry with the moving center.
That the basketball player, there's a Latin proverb, Peter, like festina lente, like hurry up slowly. Hurry up slowly.
I don't know that. Yes, interesting.
Okay, so let's stay here more. Practical exercises. These are good to work with it, for a week. Then you drop it. Then you work with another one for a week or for a few days. Then you drop it. Some you really like a lot, you work for a few months, then you drop it, so just to keep the work fresh, keep the work practical. In the module we are going to do together, me and Peter, focusing on this practically, we are going to have a whole basket with many such small aims, like hundreds of such small aims. And so we can, one for 1 day, one for a week, one for a month. We can some of the exercises we can share together. All right, another aspect of the intellectual center to watch out. Basically, in the fourth way, there was this idea that these centers, the less we remember ourselves, the more they work mechanically, automatically. So we are trying basically to catch these areas of operating automatically, unconsciously, and try to bring more self-observation and self-remembering to it. So one of this area is called this, again, associative thinking. Then we talk to a friend. Watch out when you talk to a friend. He says this, and then I say that, and then I say this, and I say that. Just try to keep an eye on, some awareness on the associative talking, and how it starts from here and it goes there, and we lose the thread. And there is just talking to fill the space and all over the place. That's how the intellectual center operates. It's associative, which is, it's okay. But then if we're all the time associating and there's no direction, there's no intentionality, then
There's no attention.
no attention. Yeah.
Earlier, Mihai, when I was describing what is identified and what does it mean that consciousness becomes identified, and it goes from fine, very rarefied consciousness to a clarity of awareness, attention, which is more specific to something, and then identification. And so by trying not to be identified, one way to be less identified is to have more attention. Now we're back at least to the level of attention.
Yeah.
It's not collapsed into identification, which is it's both a lack of attention and a collapse of attention. That's what identification is.
Yeah.
And that's how you can feel it. And so by simply trying to come back to focused attention is a step out of identification. It's not all the way out, but it's the beginning of being a little bit less identified. Now at least you are controlling your attention. And from there, you can become aware of that. And then so on back. So now it's a reversal, a recall of consciousness to its source out of identification. But we can, with each center, with each of the four centers, we can bring more attention in the moment, and that will help us be less identified. And then we have to be careful not to become identified with controlling our attention. But that's a different problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's an overall great tool at the beginning of practicing self-observation to slow things down. Yeah, because if we are fast, we can't be aware of it at the beginning. So slow things down. We had this thing like an exercise, like, okay, this is connected to the instinctive center, like drinking or eating. Yeah. In sleep, the instinctive center will take big gulps and drink while thinking about somewhere else, or the instinctive center will eat in a hurry, eating frenzy. So I'm kind of like all thinking about self-remembering and philosophy and God. It's all, and now just the animal self is just, I'm identified with the food while missing the food because it's the next bite, so that's again automatic, lack of consciousness. So okay, so coming back to this idea was that initially we try to slow things down, especially with the moving center. We slow things down so we have time to be aware of it. Yeah, this is very useful. The trap is that now I'm walking slow all the time and I'm really intentional and I'm very aware when I look at the watch, and that's not cool. That's not, that becomes some kind of acting in some way. There's some kind of stiffness. It's okay to be slow at the beginning to get a hang of it, but then ultimately it needs to be natural, and watch out for the tendency to, I'm doing some fourth way work to be seen. Oh, I'm so intentional. I'm so conscious here. Look at me,
At the same time, Mihai, at home, if you're by yourself, it can be very helpful to, for example, walk in slow motion up the stairs. Go very slowly.
Yeah.
Do the tasks you do them more slowly with as much attention as you can. But you're not making a show of it. There's no one to make a show of it to. You're doing it as a study of identification, a study of the centers, four centers, and a self-examination of consciousness. What is conscious? And what happens when I experience this thing called identification? What happens to consciousness? What happens to my movements, my thoughts, my emotions? So it's useful actually to be an actor at home if you're by yourself, and do things slowly is just one example. Another thing would be try to move more faster than normal. When you get up from your desk and you go to the kitchen, try to walk briskly on purpose and see what you observe about yourself. So all of these things can be helpful. Or as you cross the living room on the way to the kitchen, whatever, stop. Just stop and stand in the living room for 5 seconds and just be present and think about nothing else but trying to just be there, standing in the middle of the room. Because identification, one of the things, one of the signs you can detect it by is momentum. And there are different degrees of momentum. And a lot of these things we're suggesting are ways to interrupt momentum in order to see what it means to be identified. And the more we see what it means to be identified, the more capable we are of being less identified. And then ideally, we go all the way from, let's call it complete identification, to complete non-identification. Now that's a long way. I mean, that's the result of knowing about all this and working and so on. But ultimately you can get to complete non-identification. And that is the threshold into the next dimension of higher consciousness. Complete or as you were saying, de-identification. So to ask yourself, to what extent do I feel identified right now as I'm doing something? What would it mean to be doing exactly the same thing and be completely or certainly much less identified? It doesn't mean you would stop doing it. It means you would be more conscious as you did it. You got to ultimately, everyone has to learn the taste of identification. It actually always tastes the same. It just has different degrees of intensity, but it always tastes the same, and you begin to see that you weren't there while whatever it is was happening with any of the four centers. So these techniques interrupt momentum, slow down, use more attention. They're all sort of stages along this getting back to actually not being identified at all. That's a long way. That's a long way. Because it's so powerful in us, this gravitational pull for consciousness to be drawn into whatever it becomes aware of. And being patient with ourselves in this regard is also a way to not be identified.
Which one?
To be patient. We say, okay, I'm identified. We try not to be identified. We don't succeed. Then we become identified with the fact that we didn't succeed. So we have to be patient with ourselves. You were going to say something?
Yeah, I was saying like now, for our viewers and for myself, because I was listening to you, watching you. It's very easy to be like holy identification, because like Peter is talking some deep shit here, very important stuff. And it can easy to be fully lost in, or as a viewer, you can be fully lost in this image, in the screen, identify with the YouTube video about non-identification. And so as I was listening to Peter, actually it will come back to me all of this, like, okay, I'm really listening to every word. I'm not checking out. At the same time, there's some kind of sense of divided attention, in a way that some part of my attention is really listening and seeing, and then at the same time there's aware of my body here somehow, and also was aware somehow my there was a space. I don't know, there's space, and then there's a bit of a light. And so I'm aware of Peter, but also I'm aware of Mihai's body, and now also becoming aware of this voice, of Mihai's voice, and these inflections. So right now, as you are listening, you can practice this divided attention. So you're not fully lost in the YouTube video. So you keep something for yourself. You're aware of your moving center / your posture right now, aware of your emotional, sensational energies right now. You can close your eyes, and we are with the eyes open too.
I see you. It's interesting because I was having this same perception earlier, Mihai, that when I see you, I see an image in the screen, and if I'm identified, that's all I see. And then if I'm a little less identified, I realize I'm seeing a screen, a picture of you on a screen on the computer screen, in the computer, on the computer. And then if I'm even less identified, I'm aware of sitting in the chair, looking at the computer in which there is an image of you on the screen. And then if I'm even less identified, I'm seeing Peter sitting in the chair, looking at the computer, looking at the screen at an image of Mihai. So it's like dimensions of awareness. Now it's expanding. And what happens with identification is it becomes more contracted. When we're identified, our consciousness, our awareness goes into a more narrow tunnel and at a farther distance from the source of consciousness. And this can take many forms in all the centers. And the centers are each like that. They're each like a tunnel, and if through which our consciousness, our awareness traverses. And when we're identified, the tunnels get very narrow and we get stuck in them. On the contrary, when we're less identified, and it's a non-identification, self-remembering is magical in the sense that suddenly each of these tunnels gets wider. And now the centers become these huge conduits through which awareness can flow more freely while remaining aware of itself as the light passing through the tunnel.
Well, I maybe will finish with this one exercise that I started to do as we started to do these talks. And I was talking to you, Peter, that I was realizing that although, fourth way and all these teachings are alive in me and dedicated to it, these attempts to reviving the fragments of the fourth way, reviving the fourth way. I was saying that, oh wow, I feel like it's reviving within myself. The work is revived, reignited. So we are trying to reignite the fourth way out there for you guys, and we are reigniting it for ourselves, for me. So anyway, I get out of my car, where I parked the car here in California, and then I have about 100 yards or 100 meters from my car to the house, where I have, so I have this 100 yards. So I started to do this exercise when I go to work in the morning, when I leave home, as well as when I come back home. So instead of just walking with the phone, maybe listening, or I'm just walking these 100 yards unconsciously, I'm taking these 100 yards as if it's like death row. It sounds pessimistic, but no, really, so I'm really like this, and I'm really aware of each step. I'm trying to be aware of each step, not to be somewhere else, and somehow it get quiet inside, and aware of the body, and also aware of the light, the leaves. It's just being. I'm just being, effortlessly being. It's kind of coming back to myself, resting in this active being till I get home. Bam. So this twice a day, so choose a certain distance where you are focused on the work a little bit. And because these are mysterious, after some time they will activate themselves, so it's an exercise I'm trying to do. Another thing I played yesterday, this is what I did, what I mentioned. This is more about the moving center, the instinctive center. Another one with the moving center is that, let's say you choose some type of movement that usually happens automatically, as it is meant to be, and mark that as a trigger for self-remembering. For instance, yesterday I did, whenever I open a door or close a door, open a door to my car or open doors, go through the seal, I'm usually you can do this, the hand does this automatically, you don't have to be there knowingly. So, but I'll be consciously closing the door, consciously opening it, and using that as a like, remember and keep remembering, and engage this being like self-remembering ongoingly. You know, I might forget, but then the next door, you know, or going for the door seal. So this kind of stuff are very useful to make the work practical, and use it 1 day or 2 days, then change. I got a lot of benefit, Peter, from this, all these tics, these unconscious movements that Mihai has. I don't know what it is, from childhood, anxiety, fear, self-soothing, doesn't matter. But yeah, I'm getting much better now. You know, like just 2 minutes before I scratch my beard, and usually I'm doing this totally unconsciously, but now the hand went there and I was aware of it, you know. So using tics, like, okay, not to gesticulate with the right hand for a week, you know, not to gesticulate with the right hand for a week. Whenever I gesticulate, I'm remembering myself to put it down and to be more aware of talking, because it means that I was talking unconsciously and all of that. You see, the ashram, the cave is now in the fourth way. Talking, this ashram is us talking now, and I'm going to town. That's the ashram. That's the meditation retreat. So that's why we can't let these inconspicuous small moments be boring and unimportant. You know, it's our life.
It makes me think about something too, Mihai, listening to you, that when we talk about identification, it can sound as though consciousness goes somewhere. It falls into identification, but in fact, it doesn't go anywhere. Consciousness and identification, or yes, consciousness, self-consciousness, conscious awareness, and identification both always happen in the moment. And they're not actually apart from one another. They are just, as Ouspensky said, different sides of the same coin. And the coin is consciousness. It's either on the verge of and becoming identified, or it's on the verge of and becoming more conscious of itself. And and so it doesn't go anywhere. And it brought to mind the story of the prodigal son, which is really the story of the prodigal son. You can read it as a story about identification. And it's about consciousness wanting to experience identity in form. And it says to its father, its source, give me all of my money, which can be interpreted in different. And I'm going to go out into the world, which is the world of the mind and the body. And I'm going to experience myself and find myself there. And of course he does. And then he ends up living a life of debauchery, and has a moment eventually of conscience, and realizes, oh my gosh, I've wasted all of the debt I was owed. I've wasted it, all of it. I've wasted all of my conscious energy. And I'm completely now identified. And if you read the story carefully, you'll notice he doesn't actually travel back to his father's house. There's no description of him traveling back to his father's house. He simply wants to be back in his father's house. And in that moment, he had never gone anywhere. In that moment, he's back. Consciousness is back, unidentified. It's back at the point where it was not identified to begin with. And the same story is true of Dorothy.
The Wizard of Oz.
Thank you. The Wizard of Oz. When Dorothy, she's on this journey and it's all a dream. You learn in the end, it's all a dream. And in the end, she wants to go back home. She realizes finally she's discovered about the wizard. She's pulled the curtain off of the wizard and all that. And she wants to go home, and they put her in the balloon to send her home, and it doesn't work. And now she's thinking, oh my God, what do I do? And her fairy godmother says, all you have to do is tap your heels 3 times and you'll be home. And you always had this possibility. You just didn't know it. And so she taps her heels 3 times. She never goes anywhere. She's back home, and she sees it was a dream. And this is true of consciousness. And I say this because when we're identified, we may think, oh my gosh, I have to do all this stuff to no longer be identified and be conscious, be fully conscious again. And actually, it's right now. It's always right now. It's always right here. All we have to do is flip the coin if we understand what that means. And a lot of what we've been talking about, Mihai, is discovering what that means, tasting identification in ourselves, and then beginning to taste what it feels like to not be identified, and what it is for consciousness to be fully conscious as itself, as just not even as itself. It's not a thing, as consciousness. And it's always now. Everything actually is always now. All these things we've been talking about, they're always now.
Well, I think on this note, with all these esoteric fairy tales and mythology, and with the internet becoming more and more unstable, I think we can end our discussion for today. We'll continue next week with the other obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Mihai. Thank you so much.